The sun dipped low over the sprawling plantation, painting the grand mansion in shades of gold and crimson. To any passerby, the estate appeared to be a model of southern grandeur: immaculate gardens, towering columns, and servants bustling quietly in the background. But beneath this polished surface, a tension simmered, hidden in the shadows of the fields and kitchens. Samuel, a man bound by chains but unbroken in spirit, had lived in the margins of this world for years. He had observed, waited, and planned, quietly learning the habits and weaknesses of those who believed themselves untouchable. Tonight, the plantation was alive with anticipation. The master's daughter was to be married, a spectacle of wealth and status for the town to witness. The celebrations would be lavish, the wine flowing, and the laughter filling every corner of the house. Yet in the midst of the revelry, Samuel's mind was focused not on the festivities, but on a single, deliberate act of defiance, one that would shift the balance of power and force the master to confront his own helplessness. Before we step into this story, I want to know where you're watching from. What time is it? How does it feel to witness the careful patience of a man who has lived in servitude, waiting for the moment to reclaim his power? Drop a comment below, and if stories of quiet rebellion and cunning defiance pull you in, hit subscribe, because what you're about to hear has been hidden in the shadows of wealth and arrogance for far too long. The Caldwell plantation was a kingdom of power and arrogance. Its mansion rose like a fortress above acres of fields, a visible declaration of wealth and control. Every brick, every polished floorboard, and every towering column whispered the message: the masters ruled here. The enslaved, though numerous, were invisible in the eyes of those who owned them. Their labor fed the lavish lifestyle of the Caldwell family, and their suffering remained unseen or ignored by all who walked the manicured paths and grand halls. Samuel had grown up on this land, learning its rhythms, its hidden passages, and the nuances of servitude. He moved silently among the fields and the kitchens, careful to avoid the lash of the overseer, careful to blend into the background. His mind, however, was never idle. He observed every habit, every weakness, and every arrogance of the household. Over the years, he had seen cruelty dressed as tradition, oppression disguised as order. He had endured, he had survived, and he had waited. Tonight, the plantation was in chaos with anticipation. Master Caldwell had announced the wedding of his daughter, a celebration meant to showcase the family's dominance and wealth. Guests arrived in fine clothes, their horses shuffling through the carriageway, and the air buzzed with chatter about the coming festivities. Within the mansion, servants scurried about, arranging flowers, polishing silver, and preparing meals that would satisfy the delicate palates of the wealthy. Samuel's role in the preparations gave him access to the household's inner workings, a position he had long used to his advantage. He moved with quiet precision, carrying trays, adjusting arrangements, and performing tasks that would keep the master unaware of the schemes brewing around him. Every gesture, every nod, every bowed head was calculated to maintain the illusion of obedience. Master Caldwell, oblivious to the storm gathering in his own home, busied himself with his role as host. He walked through the rooms with a proud, commanding air, greeting guests, directing servants, and basking in the reflected admiration of his friends. His confidence was so absolute that it blinded him to the quiet eyes that followed him from the shadows, the eyes of Samuel, watching, waiting, planning. Even as the master boasted and joked, Samuel noted every detail. The way Caldwell adjusted the placement of the silverware, the pauses he made in conversation, the subtle ticks in his expression when he believed no one was watching. Every observation was a piece of the puzzle Samuel had been constructing for years. The blueprint of his forthcoming retribution. The kitchen, filled with the rich smells of roasting meats and baking bread, had become Samuel's sanctuary and his armory. The instruments of his service, the knives, the ladles, the very food, would become tools of subversion. It was here that he honed his plan, a careful orchestration that would ensure the master confronted a reality he had never anticipated, that the power he wielded was fragile, that his authority could be undone, and that the enslaved, long silenced, could force him to witness his own helplessness. As the candles were lit and the first guests entered the mansion's grand halls, Samuel's heart beat with a quiet anticipation. He was no longer merely a servant. Tonight, the careful patience of years would culminate in a single act, one that would force the master to confront the consequences of his arrogance. Every smile Samuel offered, every measured nod, was a mask. Beneath it lay a storm, ready to break. The wedding night, a symbol of wealth, status, and control, would become the stage for a reckoning that the master would never forget. For Samuel, the time for silence was over. The time for power had come. The day of the wedding arrived with a hum of anticipation that buzzed in the air like a quiet storm. The mansion, which had once stood as a fortress of dominance and authority, now pulsed with activity. Every room was filled with lavish displays of wealth, golden candlesticks, fresh flowers from the garden. The finest linens and guests from across the region arrived to witness the union of Master Caldwell's daughter, Elise, to a wealthy, young suitor from Charleston. The wedding was to be a grand affair, a reflection of Caldwell's power and influence, a spectacle that would confirm the family's place in the highest echelons of society. But Samuel, though part of the preparations, could not afford to be swept up in the pomp and circumstance. He moved like a shadow through the mansion, his hands steady as he arranged silver, poured wine, and attended to the guests with calculated precision. His every movement was an act of servitude, yes, but more importantly, an act of patience. He had been present for other such celebrations before, each more extravagant than the last, but this one was different. This one had a deeper meaning. Samuel knew that the night ahead would not just mark the union of a man and a woman. It would be the beginning of something far more significant, the unraveling of the master's world. He had watched the bride, Elise, for years. She had been raised to be the perfect daughter, obedient, beautiful, and compliant. Though she had no true power over her own life, she was held on a pedestal, admired for her grace and charm, and destined to marry into another powerful family. Elise's marriage to her suitor was a calculated decision, made by her father, and yet there was little room for her own desires. Samuel, having overheard her conversations with the servants, knew that she was not happy. She longed for freedom, for a life that did not revolve around her father's control, and that, Samuel knew, was the key. Her desires, her frustrations, were his leverage. He could see the cracks in the facade of her perfect life, and those cracks were the openings he needed. He had already seen how the master treated her like an object, an asset to be married off for power. Elise was a pawn in a game she had never agreed to play. The wedding preparations were in full swing, but Samuel could feel the rising tension. The guests were arriving in droves, rich men in fine suits and women draped in the finest silks, their laughter filling the halls as they admired the magnificence of the mansion. But Samuel didn't care for the guests. They were nothing more than symbols of the system he despised. As the evening wore on, the guests were ushered into the dining hall for the feast, while the master and the bride retreated to prepare for the ceremony. Samuel worked in the background, preparing the final touches, ensuring that everything would proceed smoothly. But his mind was elsewhere. He was focused on the final moment, the moment when everything would shift, when the master would be forced to face his own vulnerability. It wasn't just about the wedding, it was about the wedding night. It was about the moment when Samuel would take everything the master had stolen from him. Samuel knew the night would not end with the vows. It would end with a final act of defiance, a moment of reckoning that would be burned into the master's soul. As the evening approached, Samuel quietly positioned himself in the hall, close enough to observe, but far enough to remain unseen. The bride and her father made their way to the parlor for a final private moment before the ceremony, their conversation muffled as they exchanged words of duty and propriety. Samuel's gaze shifted to the doors that led to the master's chambers, where he would soon lock eyes with his master and take the control he had long been denied. Master Caldwell, confident in his authority, stood in the center of the room, barking orders at the servants and smiling smugly at his guests. His eyes gleamed with satisfaction, his chest puffed out as if he owned the very air around him. But Samuel knew better. Tonight, Caldwell's power would collapse under the weight of his own arrogance, As the music began to swell in the background, signaling the start of the ceremony, Samuel's mind was already turning toward the next phase of his plan. He had spent years in this house, watching and waiting for the right moment to strike. And tonight, as the wedding vows were exchanged and the celebration continued, the time for patience was over. Elise, though outwardly poised, had become the focal point of Samuel's scheme. Her desires, her frustrations, were his to wield. She, too, longed for freedom, but she had never seen a path to escape. Samuel would be her path. He would make sure of it. Tonight, she would be freed in a way that would shatter the master's world forever. As the ceremony began, Samuel took one last look at the master, who stood by, proud and oblivious. The night had already begun to unfold in Samuel's favor. He had been quiet for so long. Now, the time for silence was over. The night ahead would forever alter the balance of power. The grand dining hall was bathed in candlelight, casting a warm, flickering glow over the gilded chairs and tables. The guests sat in elegant clusters, enjoying their wine, as the air buzzed with laughter and idle conversation. But for Samuel, the moment had arrived, and he was no longer invisible. He had long learned to blend into the background, a mere shadow in the grand halls of the mansion. But tonight, he would command the attention that had always been denied to him. The wedding ceremony had ended in the grand parlor, and the newlywed couple, Master Caldwell's daughter Elise and her wealthy suitor, retreated to the bridal chamber. The guests, still preoccupied with the luxury of the feast, remained in the dining hall, unaware of the true nature of the night ahead. For Samuel, the opulence of the surroundings no longer mattered. His mind was focused entirely on the events that were about to unfold, and on the one moment when everything would change. He stood just outside the master's chambers, hidden in the shadows of the hallway, watching as the bridal couple entered. Samuel had spent months, if not years, planning this night. He knew every detail, every move. He had prepared for this moment, understanding the exact position of power in which he would force Master Caldwell to find himself helpless, humiliated, and exposed. Inside the room, Elise, the bride, stood before the mirror, her veil draped over her face. She was beautiful, poised, yet there was a sadness in her eyes, a sadness born of the realization that this marriage was not a union of love, but of control. The same control her father had wielded over her life, over her body, and now it would be passed to her new husband. Her father, Master Caldwell, entered the room behind her, his voice booming with an authoritative tone. "Tonight, you will begin your duties as my daughter's husband, and you will perform your duty with pride." Elise stood still, her eyes cast downward. She had no choice in the matter, no say in the life her father had planned for her. Samuel had watched the marriage preparations closely, noting the tension in Elise's eyes. She had accepted her fate, at least outwardly. But Samuel knew better. He knew the woman she longed to be, the woman trapped beneath the layers of family duty and wealth. Tonight, that woman would finally break free. The master's voice was still harsh as he ordered Elise to prepare for the night ahead. "Go on, child," he said, his voice grating. "It's time. Your husband awaits." Elise, looking like a porcelain doll in her wedding dress, nodded stiffly. Her father's eyes never strayed from her, the power dynamics clear in the way he commanded her to obey. As the master turned away, confident in his ability to control the night, Samuel saw his opportunity. He had already positioned himself, waiting just out of sight in the corridor. The door to the bridal chamber was slightly ajar, and the sounds of the master's footsteps grew distant. The time had come for Samuel to enact his plan. He stepped forward quietly, his movements deliberate, blending into the shadows that lined the walls. Inside the bridal chamber, the groom, young and proud, waited for his new wife, oblivious to the dark game being played. His mind was clouded with expectations, eager to claim his prize. Elise entered, her veil still covering her face, her movements stiff. The groom smiled, his eyes wide with anticipation, as he moved toward her. "Elise," he said softly, his voice carrying the sweetness of new love or what he believed to be love. "Come, my bride. I've waited so long for this moment. But Elise didn't respond. She remained still, her back to him as she stood by the window, staring out at the moonlit night. Her heart was heavy with the weight of the wedding night, the night when her freedom would be sealed forever. But somewhere, deep within her, there was a flicker of rebellion, a spark that had always been there, hidden behind the constraints of her father's control. The groom reached for her, but before he could touch her, a sharp knock echoed through the door. It startled both him and Elise, and the groom turned, his eyes narrowing in confusion. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice strained. Samuel, still hidden in the shadows, watched as the bride and groom exchanged glances. Elise's eyes widened as the door slowly creaked open. There, standing in the doorway, was Samuel, the slave who had watched and waited, now stepping into the heart of the room where everything would change. Samuel's presence filled the room with an invisible tension. The groom hesitated, but Samuel stepped forward without a word, his every movement calculated. "You," the groom stammered, his voice dripping with arrogance. "You dare come in here?" Elise stood frozen, her body tense. She had no idea what Samuel was doing, why he had appeared at this moment. But Samuel's eyes met hers, and in that brief exchange, she understood. He wasn't just a servant anymore. He had become a force, an agent of change in this house, in this world that had once been ruled by her father's dominance. Samuel's voice was quiet but filled with an unspoken power. "Tonight, you will witness a marriage of true power. You will watch while I claim what was never yours to control." The groom took a step back, his eyes widening in disbelief. But it was too late. Samuel was already moving, his presence undeniable. The groom's protests were drowned out by Samuel's forceful actions, his dominance taking hold in a way that no one could stop. The master had no say in what would happen tonight. The night unfolded in a way that would forever alter the lives of all in that room. Samuel made his master watch as he took the bride, forcing the master to confront the power he thought he held, forcing him to see how easily it had slipped away. The groom, too, was helpless in the face of this dark twist of fate. Tonight, the master's world, built on cruelty and control, came crashing down in the most intimate, most personal way possible. And as the night wore on, the weight of Samuel's victory became clear not just in the act itself, but in the quiet, deliberate subversion of power. The master, broken and humiliated, was left to witness the consequences of his arrogance, his cruelty, and his control. For Samuel, this was not only about vengeance. It was about reclaiming his dignity, his power, and his right to choose his own fate. The events of the wedding night unfolded with a strange calmness, as though the world outside the bridal chamber had continued spinning while everything inside had come to a screeching halt. Master Caldwell, once a man of immeasurable power and pride, now sat at the edge of his daughter's wedding bed, his mind racing in shock. His arrogance had made him believe that the authority he wielded over his daughter, his wealth, and his land was untouchable, that no one could break the unspoken chains that held his family in place. But tonight, he was forced to watch as his world crumbled, piece by fragile piece. Samuel stood tall, his hands steady, his breath calm as he took control in the most intimate of spaces, one that was, until now, the exclusive domain of Caldwell and his family. The moments of humiliation, the silent struggle within the master's eyes, were something Samuel had anticipated, but they still carried the weight of decades of suffering. This was the moment of reckoning, the culmination of years spent in silence, in waiting, in watching. Elise, though still trapped in her wedding gown, was no longer the trembling bride in a forced union. In that moment, she was no longer under her father's command, nor her husband's. She had been freed not by escape, but by the breaking of the very system that had bound her. The groom, bewildered and unable to process the shock of what was unfolding, sat against the bed, his eyes darting between Samuel and the master. His desire to possess and claim had crumbled to nothing, a forgotten ideal in the face of Samuel's quiet, precise vengeance. He had been a pawn in Caldwell's grand design, a pawn now made irrelevant by Samuel's presence. "Please," the groom began, his voice cracking. But Samuel only regarded him with a cold, calculating look. "You do not get to speak here." Samuel said with chilling authority, his voice like steel wrapped in velvet. "You are not a part of this. Tonight, you will learn that power is not something you are born with. It's something you take. And tonight, I've taken what you thought you owned." The groom trembled but remained silent, realizing the futility of further words. Samuel's eyes never wavered from Master Caldwell, whose own expression twisted between fury, confusion, and a quiet, dawning realization that he had been completely outwitted. Master Caldwell's eyes narrowed as he struggled to control his emotions, the desperation evident in every line of his face. This will not go unpunished," he spat, his voice low and threatening. "You will regret this." Samuel smirked, his gaze unflinching. "Punished? You speak of punishment as though you still have control over anything, Caldwell. You think your threats can reach me here, in this room, in this moment of power that I now hold." The master's hands balled into fists, but there was a tremor in his fingers. The force he once commanded seemed far away. The authority he wielded over the plantation now a hollow shell. The humiliation he was experiencing was something that could never be undone. This act of defiance, this quiet rebellion, was more than Samuel's revenge. It was his taking back of what had been stolen from him and everyone like him. "You've lost, Caldwell," Samuel continued, his tone still cold, steady, and overpowering. "You've lost everything, your land, your pride, your family. You no longer have the power to hurt anyone." The master's face turned crimson as he fought for words, but his anger now seemed impotent. The servants, the overseers, those who had once trembled at his every command were gone, and there was no one left to enforce his will. Meanwhile, Elise stood silently, her back to Samuel, her head held high. In her eyes, there was no longer the fear or reluctance she had worn for so many years. There was a quiet understanding, an acceptance of the fact that the world she had been born into had shattered, and with that shattering, her future was now in her hands. "Elise," Master Caldwell choked out, his voice barely a whisper. "Don't let him do this to you. You're my daughter. This is wrong." Elise turned slowly, her gaze locking with her father's. For a moment, the room was filled with a tension so thick it could be cut with a knife. But in her eyes, there was no fear, only resolve. "I am your daughter, yes," she said, her voice steady and calm. "But I am also a woman who has been enslaved by your whims for too long. And tonight, I've been freed." With those words, Elise turned back to Samuel, her expression hardening. She no longer sought the approval of the man who had controlled her life, her body, her very existence. She had witnessed her father's humiliation and had finally recognized the truth: his power over her was as fragile as glass, easily shattered by the act of rebellion that Samuel had orchestrated. For the first time in her life, Elise felt a sense of control over her own fate. And it was Samuel, an enslaved man, a man bound by chains who had been told time and time again that he was nothing, who had shown her that freedom was not something given, but something fought for and taken. As the hours passed, the oppressive weight of the night began to settle into the room. The guests, long forgotten, had been dismissed, unaware of the true drama that had unfolded behind the closed doors. Only the master, the groom, and Samuel remained in the chamber. And as the night wore on, Samuel could feel the power shift, like an invisible weight lifting from his shoulders. The system of oppression had been cracked open, and for the first time, he stood in the center of it, unshackled. Master Caldwell, once so sure of his dominance, was broken not by force, but by the quiet, patient strategy of the very man he had enslaved. It wasn't bloodshed or violence that had taken him down. It was the act of being forced to witness the very power he had taken for granted slip through his fingers like sand. "I'll never forget this," Caldwell muttered, though there was no fire in his words. It was a hollow threat. He was powerless now. Samuel leaned in close, his voice low and final. "You don't need to remember, Caldwell. I've already taken everything from you. Your pride, your power, your control. It's all gone, and you'll never get it back." The morning sun crept over the horizon, casting soft, golden rays through the heavy curtains of the bridal chamber. The mansion, which had been so full of life the previous evening, was now eerily quiet, as though it too was reeling from the events of the night. The once proud Caldwell estate, a symbol of wealth and dominance, had become a hollow shell, its foundations shaken by the defiant act of a man who had once been invisible. Inside the bridal chamber, Master Caldwell, now a shell of the powerful man he had been, sat hunched in a chair, his hands trembling as they clutched the armrests. His once imposing frame was slumped in defeat, his face pale, his eyes bloodshot from a sleepless night spent in quiet rage and humiliation. The remnants of his wedding celebration lay scattered around him, half-eaten plates of food, spilled wine, and the remnants of what had once been his grand vision of control. He could still feel the presence of Samuel in the room, his cold, calculating gaze, the power that had shifted when Samuel had taken everything from him. The weight of it all was suffocating, and Caldwell could no longer ignore the truth that had been made so painfully clear. His world was crumbling, and it had crumbled because of Samuel. The bride, Elise, had already left the room. The sound of her footsteps had faded as she walked away from the man who had controlled her life for so long, heading toward a future that no longer included her father's grasping hands. In her eyes, there had been no fear or hesitation. She had finally understood that the chains that bound her were not iron but a fragile illusion, and once those chains were shattered, nothing could hold her back. Elise, who had once been his prized possession, had now become the symbol of his downfall. It was she who had been forced into a marriage that had never been her choice. It was she who had been handed over to another man like property. And now, it was she who had walked away from the man who had decided her fate. Elise had witnessed the collapse of the very system her father had built, and she had chosen freedom over submission. That choice, more than anything, had shattered him. As the reality of the night's events began to settle over him like a cold weight, Master Caldwell felt something he had never felt before: vulnerability. His once untouchable world was gone, and in its place was only the bitter taste of defeat. He had never imagined a slave, someone like Samuel, would have the power to bring down his empire. But it was Samuel who had orchestrated the downfall of the master, not with violence, but with quiet cunning and patience. The door to the chamber creaked open, and the young groom, still reeling from the shock of the night, stepped inside. His face was pale, his eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep, and his posture slouched with the weight of the realization that his marriage, his new life, had been nothing but an illusion. The wedding night he had anticipated with excitement had become a nightmare, one where he was powerless and humiliated before his bride and the man he had once believed was beneath him. "Master," the groom said hesitantly, his voice cracking. What do we do now?" Caldwell's eyes met the young man's, but there was no answer. There was no plan, no strategy left. The master of the house, the one who had commanded so much for so long, was now reduced to a man who could only sit in his own broken world, unable to change what had happened. The groom fidgeted, unable to meet Caldwell's gaze for long. The guilt, the shame, was too much for him. He had been complicit in this entire farce of a marriage, and now he was realizing that his new bride, Elise, had never truly been his. She had been a prize to claim, but now, in the wake of Samuel's rebellion, she was a symbol of something far greater, of freedom, of defiance, and of the breaking of chains that had bound them all. The groom began again, but his voice trailed off, his words meaningless in the face of the reality they were both trapped in. I never thought it would be like this." Caldwell's mouth twisted into a bitter smile, a faint, empty gesture. "Neither did I." Caldwell's mouth. He looked at the floor, his mind swirling with the knowledge that everything he had worked for, everything he had controlled, had come to an end. His daughter, the jewel of his wealth, had slipped from his grasp. His authority, once so absolute, had been shattered in a single night. And Samuel, the man he had once owned, had taken everything from him not through force, but through a quiet, deliberate act of power. It was in that moment, sitting in the room where his world had collapsed, that Caldwell realized the true cost of his arrogance. He had never imagined that someone like Samuel, someone he had treated as less than human, could bring him to this point. But Samuel had done just that, and in doing so, he had shown Caldwell just how fragile his empire was. Outside the chamber, Samuel stood in the shadows, his eyes watching as the master, the groom, and the broken pieces of the Caldwell family's world fell apart. His work was not done yet. There was more to be done, more to dismantle, but he knew that the power had already shifted. As the groom exited the room, his shoulders slumped in defeat. Samuel stepped forward, his movements measured and deliberate. He had always been patient, and now that patience was paying off. He entered the chamber, where Master Caldwell sat in silence, broken by his own failure. Samuel's presence filled the room, quiet and undeniable. "It's over, Caldwell," Samuel said softly, his voice smooth but filled with an unspoken power. "You have nothing left. Your world is crumbling, and there's nothing you can do to stop it." Caldwell looked up, his eyes dull, his spirit crushed. "What do you want from me?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "I want nothing," Samuel replied, his gaze steady. "I've already taken everything." And with those words, Samuel turned and left, walking out of the chamber as the weight of the night's events settled over the once proud master. Caldwell, a man who had lived with absolute control for so long, now faced the final truth. He was powerless. The sun rose slowly over the Caldwell plantation, casting a soft light over the land that had once been the heart of wealth, power, and control. The fields, the house, and the servants, everything that had once been part of the great machine of dominance, lay still in the quiet of the morning, as if the earth itself had exhaled a long, relieved breath. The mansion, though grand in structure, seemed to sag under the weight of the events that had unfolded the night before. Inside the estate, everything had changed. The powerful, oppressive air that had once filled the halls was gone, replaced by an emptiness that rang louder than any argument or clash of wills. Master Caldwell, once a symbol of dominance, was now a shadow of the man he had been. The pride that had once fueled his every step had evaporated, leaving behind only the stark reality of his vulnerability. His daughter, Elise, had left his side no longer bound to him by blood or duty, but liberated by the very actions of the man he had owned. Samuel had watched it all unfold, watched the house of cards that was Caldwell's world collapse under the weight of a single night. And now, as the light of a new day broke over the plantation, Samuel knew the world he had known was gone. But in its place, there was something much more powerful: freedom. The door to the master's study creaked open, and Samuel entered. He had kept his distance from Caldwell since the events of the night before. But now, with everything hanging in the balance, Samuel knew it was time to confront the shattered remnants of the master's world. Caldwell was sitting by the window, his back to Samuel, staring out over the fields with dull eyes. He seemed unaware of Samuel's presence at first, as if the world outside had become more real to him than the one he had built inside the mansion. "The remnants of a broken man. You're still here," Caldwell muttered, his voice hollow. "I thought you would have left by now, having gotten what you wanted." Samuel stood still, his arms crossed, his gaze unwavering. "What I wanted," he echoed softly. "I wanted something much more than what you've lost, Caldwell. I wanted something that cannot be taken from me." Caldwell's shoulders tensed at the words. He turned slowly, his eyes narrowing, though the spark of anger had long since faded from them. "What is it you want, then? You've taken my wealth, my pride, my family's future. What more is there?" Samuel's lips curled into a faint smile, one that held no satisfaction, only a sense of quiet finality. "I want nothing from you, Caldwell. You have nothing left to give. What I took from you, you gave me every day. The very system you built, the chains you wrapped around me and the others, it was always fragile. I was always patient enough to wait for it to break." Caldwell stared at him for a long moment, his face contorted with bitterness and defeat. But there was something else there, too, something like recognition. "You think this is over, don't you?" he said, his voice quieter now. "You think that with my fall, the world changes. But nothing changes. You'll always be beneath us. You'll never be truly free." Samuel took a step forward, his voice calm but firm. "I'm already free, Caldwell. I always was. But now, you'll know what it feels like to be powerless." The words settled heavily in the room. Caldwell's mouth opened and closed, but no response came. His pride, which had once defined him, was now crushed under the weight of Samuel's gaze. There was no longer any point in fighting, no longer any point in holding on to a life that had been built on the suffering of others. "I gave you a choice, Caldwell," Samuel said softly. "You could have treated your people with dignity. You could have seen the value in human life beyond the labor we provided. But instead, you chose to rule with fear. You chose to break us, and now you are the one who is broken." Caldwell's eyes flickered with something resembling remorse, something that might have been guilt, but the depth of it was lost beneath years of arrogance. The truth, now fully exposed, had left him hollow. Samuel turned, his hand resting on the doorframe, but before he could leave, he spoke once more. "Elise is free. She doesn't need your name or your wealth to be powerful. She's free to choose her own life now, and no one can ever take that from her. And the rest of us, we'll take what you thought was yours. We'll take the future." As Samuel stepped out into the hallway, he felt the weight of the night's events settle into the very air around him. The plantation, once a symbol of oppression and dominance, now felt like an empty relic. The chains that had once bound him, the ones that had held him and so many others in place, were gone. And in their place, something far more dangerous had emerged, a quiet, steady resolve to never again be owned by anyone. As the days passed, the plantation began to feel different. The air was lighter, freer. The enslaved people, once silenced by fear, began to move with purpose, reclaiming their power in small, quiet ways. They no longer feared the overseers or the master. Samuel's quiet rebellion had sparked a fire, one that would not be easily extinguished. Elise, too, had found her way. She had left the mansion, taking nothing but the freedom she had longed for. And while her father was left to pick up the pieces of his shattered life, Elise walked into a future that was her own to claim. Samuel, now a man who had taken back his dignity, his power, and his freedom, knew this was only the beginning. The world would never be the same, and neither would he.